Hi, everyone. I'm Julianna Forlander. You're watching ACT.tv live on YouTube. We're also on Facebook and on Twitch. Living through a global pandemic has been a wake-up call for many about how we're taking care of ourselves and keeping healthy. For those plugged into the climate movement, we know that our physical health is inextricably linked to the health of the planet. Here to give us the latest in climate and environmental news and activism is writer Steve Horn. Steve is a San Diego, California-based climate reporter and a producer for the Real News Network, also a freelance investigative reporter. His work has appeared in the Intercept, The Guardian, Al Jazeera America, Vice News, Wisconsin Watch, CounterPunch, TruthOut, TYT Investigates, and now here at ACT.tv. Steve, thanks for joining us.
Good to be back. Thanks for having me.
It's great. You recently wrote, let's start with the geoengineering piece. For everyone who doesn't know already, what is geoengineering?
Yeah, so geoengineering is a long contested climate policy that has become a little bit more, I think in some circles, more inevitable as the climate crisis has gotten worse. But basically, these are techniques to reverse engineer the climate crisis. So basically, technologies that can pull carbon out of the atmosphere that most of them have not been tested at large scale. So they're ideas right now. But yeah, so uh, they're sort of like, I'm trying to have the words for it. There are techniques that are pulling it from the air, and there are techniques that are ways to like store carbon potentially in the ground, things like biochar or things like solar radiation. But these are all like convoluted technological techniques that have sort of been used as a way by especially in recent years, by the fossil fuel industry to think that they can continue business as usual because down the road they can have these technologies that might, and that's the big word, that might pull the carbon dioxide or the greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. And so you can sort of, the way I would put it most simply is geoengineering is a way to have your cake and eat it too, basically.
Why is geoengineering suddenly in the news? Why should we be cautious about it other than the fact that it provides a nice, a convenient kick the can down the road excuse for oil and gas producers?
Yeah. Okay. So geoengineering was for many years and this is what makes it news, but for many years, a very fringe proposal. A lot of people sort of on the sidelines of the climate debate pushing this and hadn't really gotten a lot of mainstream traction. But I noticed back in March, right before, or sorry, I think it was March or February, right before COVID got huge, basically. In California, they had a hearing. It's actually in February, sorry. They had a hearing, an annual update on greenhouse gas emissions and the greenhouse gas inventory in the state. And the very top climate person in California, the chairwoman of the California Air Resources Board, Mary Nichols, she came out and said, hey, this is something that we should like really consider. She didn't say they don't call it geoengineering because the term is so controversial within the climate community. But she touted one technique of geoengineering called direct air capture. So I started. This is not so much in the video, but just for follow-up reporting that I've been doing. I've noticed that it's become a lot more mainstream within the climate community. So it's definitely not in the fringes anymore. That's what makes it news, I think, today.
We have a little, I watched the video that you have out, and we're going to, on Real News, and we have a little piece of it, and I'm going to play here. But at the beginning of the video, which was kind of skipping over, it made mention that Donald Trump was talking about geoengineering solutions. Does that mean that he is saying that, yes, we have a problem with climate change?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think that I think that it's a tacit admission, right? I mean, it's because to push this technology, you have to realize that there's carbon that has to be pulled out of the atmosphere. So I didn't even address that in the video, but yeah, I think that's a good takeaway conclusion. Yeah.
You can leave that to the comedians. This will make an excellent comedy satire video of clipping back and forth, him saying, there's no such thing. It's a liberal hoax, and now let's fix it. This is the perfect
Absolutely
video. So let me share this piece of this video. Can you set up what we're about to see? I think it's the piece where it says, rather than addressing the root cause of the climate change, we're going to be masking the impact of it. Oh, are you there, Steve?
I'm here.
Okay. Okay, here, let's take a look, see. A quick second to share my screen. It's a lot of technology going on here to make the news when you're doing it yourself. Oh yeah, okay, there it is. Sorry about the lag there. Okay. And this is posted. You can watch the whole thing at therealnews.com.
Favored by big oil. That's the case because it does not ask them to reduce emissions or their carbon footprint, but simply invest in more technology.
It's the idea that rather than addressing the root causes of climate change, which are the massive and unsustainable burning of fossil fuels, we will instead either mask the impacts of climate change by modifying the amount of sunlight that reaches the Earth, or we will magically suck carbon out of the atmosphere even while we continue to burn massive amounts of fossil fuels.
This is kind of what you just said, Steve. And yeah. So here's are there other, I just read a piece about how Bill Gates wants to spray particles in the air to reflect the sun. Isn't that a horrible idea? I mean, don't plants need sun in order to grow and make our food?
That's the thing, is like the all of these techniques to various degrees, there's not a lot of proof that it can be scaled up, A, and B, there's not a lot of study that looks at the negative impacts. And how do you actually know the negative impacts of some of the things unless you try them? But once you try them and do it, it could be horrific potentially. So
What
that's
about
always
the fact that we already have like an Earth and a system that works? And if we just stop doing the thing that makes the system that works not work,
exactly.
That would be fine. Okay.
That's what the climate justice movement, and that's what the environmental justice movement has been saying for years. I think the nut of this story, though, is that I think it's I mean the climate leader, quote unquote, state, California, now that they've taken the mantle of pushing one of these techniques, and it speaks volumes to how much geoengineering has moved to the mainstream. And I think, just to get to your last point, yeah, Bill Gates is also a proponent of this technique that's in this video, which is direct air capture. I just also want to toss out the fact that ExxonMobil is a proponent of it. So is Occidental.
All these people you can't trust.
Yeah, exactly. People
billionaires and billionaires in the oil industry, when they're behind it, you got to question what's going on.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, not great. So besides spraying particles in the air and blocking out the sun and carbon capture, are there other geoengineering projects that we should be kind of keeping our wary eyes out for?
Well, there was one that I was reporting on years ago called Biochar, which is a form of basically using the ground, putting carbon in the ground, basically charcoal, through this complex process called pyrolysis. Doesn't really matter I don't want to get too into the science of it. Basically, it was another thing that was promoted by the fossil fuel industry, and it would have taken so much land to pull it off. I think that it was like something like to actually achieve it, it would have been like the size of India or something like that. And it never really got off the ground, but that was one that was, and I see it kind of reemerging today. They've rebranded it. They call it regenerative agriculture. So you might hear that term tossed around a lot of ways. That means biochar. It doesn't only mean that, but that's lumped within that category. So if you are looking at solutions, you might hear regenerative agriculture. And I know that for many years, biochar was being talked about as part of that. And there were issues with biochar for sure. I think there might have been some potential also, but the way that it was being talked about and scaled up without a lot of proof of how it could work, that's always the issue with these. There's these solutions are talked about as silver bullets, when the real, goes back to what you were saying, is the real solutions here are just cutting down on our consumption of fossil fuels and in general consumption of our system. That's the endless growth system. I know that the Michael Moore documentary was controversial, but I think that the point was salient in that documentary is there's an issue with our system of endless economic growth. I think that point was
I
true.
agree.
Yeah.
With that. Yeah. So we watched the video also from the Real News about how the coronavirus has depleted the value of oil. And now many are talking about nationalizing the industry, as was discussed in that video. Why is that being suggested? And is there a chance that this could happen?
I would say there's almost a nil chance of it happening right now, especially with the formation of our Congress being split. Even if it was all Democrats, I think it would be a uphill battle. I mean, we also have President Trump,
But
but
it
I
all
think,
starts with talking, right? I mean,
yeah, I
once
think
it
that
comes on the table, yeah.
exactly, yeah, the framework is there, and the reason why that those who think that this is a good solution is a good one is because it puts the issue. I think it's not just nationalization, it's also, I think that another term for it could be democratization. The vision of it is putting the future of this natural resource in the hands of the people, and like it doesn't mean shutting it down entirely, but it means winding it down and also giving the people who work in the industry and those affected by the industry a say in what comes next. So even if it doesn't mean like a quote unquote full nationalization, I think something more along the lines of a democratization is the vision of those who are behind this push for sure.
Are there other oil producing countries who are having this same conversation and who might be closer to democratization of that industry?
Probably Norway would be the closest. It's an actual democracy that has nationalized their industry. I
Did you
think
say
some
it's an actual democracy?
well, because you want to give the counter would be like Saudi Arabia. They've nationalized their industry for decades, but it's not at all a democracy. So that was something we went over in the video, which is like nationalization is not necessarily like just that in of itself is not a silver bullet, and it can often just lead to authoritarian decisions being made for the oil and gas industry, or just like oil and state being merged together as one, which honestly isn't that different than the United States right now. We don't call it nationalization, but we just call it like big money in politics. But that said, yeah, I think that probably Norway would be the closest, but even that, they rely so much on the revenue from offshore drilling in Norway that is not the vision behind the nationalization of these people, which is it's a means of winding it down for the purpose of climate change, as opposed to just getting money from it to pour into the economic system, which would be the Norway case.
So we had a question coming from our chat, and excuse me, chat folks, that I don't remember who put it up when we were watching the video. How is it that these oil and gas industries are saying they're bankrupt after they've been profitable for the last however many decades? They've made millions of dollars in profit. How are they saying, oh, we're out of money, we have to close down, now we're completely failing? Could you just explain this to me a little bit?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's a split within the industry, really. The biggest companies are very profitable, the Exxon Mobils, the Chevrons, the Shells of the world. But the companies that are doing in the United States, a lot of the fracking or a lot of the offshore drilling are not as profitable, because doing that kind of drilling is very expensive. And actually, the way the system works is Exxon was not in the lead on fracking in the United States. It was smaller companies. Exxon has since merged into some companies or purchased companies over the years, but they didn't want to take the lead on it because it's so expensive. And so basically, we see that the way this debate has played out is the biggest companies actually are not in favor of a bailout. They want to see these small companies fall by the wayside and fail, because it means that they can purchase them, the ones that they want, on the cheap, or for pennies on the dollar, really. So that's sort of how it's playing out. So the companies that have gotten the bailout are not the Exxon Mobils or the Chevrons or the Shells. It's actually the one tier below that, and they've gotten the bailout. The biggest measure happened a couple of weeks ago through the Federal Reserve. They adjusted a program called the Main Street Loan Program that would include slightly bigger companies, still not the size of ExxonMobil or Shell, but the ones that are the pioneers of fracking in the United States can now get loans from the Federal Reserve to maybe keep them afloat. But I think the big picture here is fracking has never been profitable for the companies who are engaged in it, and this was a problem before COVID-19, and that's the criticism.
I mean, they're destroying the planet, they're destroying the country with fracking, and it's not even profitable.
Right, and that's the criticism also, is that this economic crisis pre-existed COVID-19. They're using COVID-19 as the rationale for them, going under, but these problems long pre-existed for years before COVID-19 for the financial
What
issue.
is the benefit to the Trump administration for bailing out the fracking industry? Is it just to try to keep our oil and gas production within the country? How can they?
The two, yeah, there's the main justification, of course, is this is a huge part of his agenda, the quote unquote energy dominance agenda, frack everywhere and sell it around the world via
Frack
export.
underneath his buildings on Manhattan,
Yeah,
everywhere but what he owns.
exactly. Or everywhere but where Rex
Gulf Coast.
Tillerson lived, where he was actually suing years ago the former CEO of Exxon when fracking came to his backyard. But anyway,
Yeah, I remember that. He was like, "It's fine everywhere but my house." Yeah,
exactly. Oh, the former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, I should say, not just the CEO. But yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is just to look at like the politics of this for a second. Is one of his top aides is Harold Hamm, who is a huge person in the fracking.
Oh, Steve, you've kind of zoned out there. I don't want to miss this. Are you
Oh,
still there?
can you see me?
Oh,
Can you hear
I
me?
can see you and I can hear you. Okay, can you just rewind a bit to Harold Hamm? That's the last thing we heard.
Sure. Yeah. It says my internet connection's unstable, so I hope I don't drop.
We'll do our best, but we
Okay.
appreciate you being here irregardless.
Might mean this is my first and last time with this background. I wonder if it's taking up bandwidth. But anyway, yeah, Harold Hamm is the founder and CEO of Continental Resources, and he has Trump's ear on these issues. So he's a major donor to Trump, and he was his one of his top energy advisors in 2016. He's a big donor in 2020. So I think that a lot of the decisions that Trump is making have to do with Harold Hamm's lobbying and basically just doing the bidding of Harold Hamm and his company Continental Resources. So I talked about that Main Street lending program of the Federal Reserve. So his company's on the bigger side, but the way that it was repackaged a couple weeks ago, now Continental Resources can get bailout money that they could not get before. So that'd be one example among many. So he's been in those meetings. Trump has been having meetings, or had one big meeting in particular with CEOs of companies, and it was all the big companies. And then Harold Hamm was also there. So Exxon, Chevron, and then a couple others, but also Harold Hamm. So I think that was indicative of how influential Harold Hamm is in particular. And he's been influential in Republican Party politics for the past decade or so.
So on some level, Donald Trump is actually going against the large oil companies by bailing out the mid-size and smaller fracking companies.
Yeah, I think that would be an accurate way of putting it. Yeah, I think at least they're not like adamantly opposed to it, but they're not. I mean, they're pretty much. I mean, they're pretty set against it. Like American Petroleum Institute. I mean, I don't know how fervently they're against it and how angry this makes them, but they've been vocal in their support at the very least. I'm not sure if this is like a devastating decision, but I think that they saw it as more like a disaster capitalism opportunity for themselves. Is like if these companies do go under, wow, we can really buy these other companies up on the cheap, and I think that will happen anyway. So that's why I think that it's almost like a win-win for them, maybe, because even this bailout money, I don't know if this will save a lot of companies. I still think that hundreds could go bankrupt, hundreds could even go to the stage of liquidation. So
So
I
if you
think that,
wanted to buy a fracking company, now's the time. Get
yeah.
in on it. Um, a question coming in from our chat on the Twitch stream, and also just a welcome to everyone who is raiding in from A Difficult Truth. We appreciate that raid so much. Question from Touring News. Mr. Horn, have you heard of olivine seeding of beaches around equatorial zones to convert carbon dioxide into bicarbonate?
Oh man, I haven't. So I couldn't even say anything smart about that or comment on it at all. I have not. There's so many of these different Technofix solutions though that are out there. I would just recommend that everyone watching view them with some skepticism, because a lot of times these aren't like peer reviewed type of scientifically peer reviewed proposals, and there's a lot of enthusiasm around them because of the crisis that we face. But I think there should be an equal amount of, or even more, skepticism of them as we move forward through how we're going to tackle the climate crisis.
You're watching Act TV. We are talking to Steve Horn. Steve is a San Diego-based climate reporter and producer for the Real News Network and freelance journalist of everywhere you get decent and real and not fake news. So we're happy
Usually
that
not fake.
you know. So we just had a victory here in New York, stopping a frack gas pipeline. Can you talk about the latest updates in the fight against the Keystone XL pipeline? What should we be looking out for as this fight continues to wage on?
Yeah, well, there was actually almost a monumental, I would say, legal victory that took place in the past week or two with Keystone XL. And I think that it's flown under the radar of how important it is, because it was applied to Keystone XL, but also more broadly. And that was the program that is used to permit these pipelines that go through multiple states for the past 8 years has been something called the Nationwide Permit 12 program by the Army Corps of Engineers. And basically that deals with any pipeline that crosses a body of water, like a river. And it was only supposed to be used for projects that are half an acre in size or smaller, so very small infrastructure projects. But this was an industry loophole that got deployed under the Obama administration, and many times under both Obama and Trump, it was used to permit pipelines. But a judge in Montana has ruled the program to be basically scrapped and taken back to the drawing board. So you can't really use it for oil and gas pipelines anymore. And it was used for Keystone XL under the Trump administration recently. And so that they have already begun construction in Montana. But basically, this is not only going to put a halt on construction, but may put a halt on construction of many pipelines going forward if it depending on what happens in the appeals court. So now it was in the district court. Now it recently got appealed. The industry has intervened in the case. So officially it's like Sierra Club and some other environmental groups versus Army Corps of Engineers, but really it's Sierra Club versus Army Corps of Engineers and the whole oil and gas industry apparatus, which has intervened in the case. So this is like a red alert moment for the oil and gas industry. I think it'll be really important going forward if they don't have this, when basically the way the industry is describing it, this could cost them potentially billions of dollars and years upon years of permitting delays if they don't have this program. But the program was never really meant to be used in the way that it was used, and it's been a way to defy our bedrock environmental law, which is the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, which involves public hearings and public engagement and a way for people to actually be involved in the process. This is a way to undercut all of this before.
Well, that's great news. That's the best news I've heard in a month.
Yeah, I think it's surprising that I think that if it wasn't for COVID-19, we would be hearing more about just how monumental it was. I think it's kind of gotten lost, but it's absolutely a huge case, and it will be decided in the appeals court. Probably it's been put on an expedited schedule, so there may even be a decision made in the next 2-3 weeks on it.
Well, we're excited about that. And, we here at Act TV want to bring you that kind of news. We are sure you can get the death count numbers somewhere else. But here, that's what we're talking about. We spoke about how the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation denied the quality certification for the Northeast Supply pipeline project. They basically, determined that construction of the pipeline wouldn't meet the state's water quality standards. It's a huge win. My friends over at Sane Energy have been working on that for years. Do you think, are we seeing some wins and some stops in the pipeline projects across the board, or are these kind of the win over at Keystone XL and here at my home in New York? Are they outliers?
I think the Keystone XL one has potential to be, there already was a legal challenge based upon that ruling down in Texas it's called the Permian Highway Pipeline. So they cited this new ruling as their way to say that the same sort of pattern played out there. So I think that the legal precedent will carry potentially in a lot of other places, depending on what happens in the appeals court. And the way I see it, just to analyze it a little bit further, I could see this kind of case going all the way to the United States Supreme Court. I don't know if it would for sure, but if they
terrible news.
that would be the bad news.
No.
But yeah, so I think that Yeah, I think that also, just to go back to our discussion about oil prices and the state of the industry and these bailouts, I think that we're going to see there's going to be more reluctance to give permits to pipelines because there's like no one that's buying the oil right now and buying the gas. It's the market is completely different now with COVID-19. It's going to be completely different for years to come. So I'll be very interested to see how pipeline battles play out in this, now that we're not in this age of abundance anymore, that we've really entered into a completely different economic era. So I think that's something to look out for, is do these new economic arguments play into these debates over pipelines? I think that we haven't really seen it yet because it's so soon and so sudden with COVID-19, but we'll see it in the weeks and months to come for sure.
Can you talk about, shifting gears here a little bit, can you talk about the climate committee that Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden recently announced? What will this committee be tasked with? What does it say about Biden's commitment to the climate movement?
Well, I think it depends on who you ask, but some people would say that this is just like a sort of 2016 all over again. It's a way to appease the climate movement. It's a way to get them to feel like, I mean, that would be one argument. It's like, well, they're just kind of writing this helping write the platform, but what does the platform really mean if the party doesn't even follow the platform in Congress? So that's one way of looking at it. Another one.
Wait. Not to go back, but if Hillary Clinton had been elected, you don't think that she would have made good on the platform that Bernie helped put together?
I guess it's hard to say. I mean, I think the bottom line is it would have taken a fight to hold her to it. I guess I don't even remember all the things that they had gotten out of her, but I think like one of them was like the one that I remember was regulations on fracking and like closing the Halliburton loophole. I think that would have been the Halliburton loophole is the exemption that the industry has to the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Clean Water Act.
Clean water, do whatever you want.
So she was, they I think they had gotten that into the platform. I think it would have taken a heck of a fight to actually close that, and it probably also would have meant like a legal fight and all of that. So I think that it's hard for me to say. I think in general, if you look at the Democratic Party platform over the past each 4-year cycle, it's actually generally very progressive. But then if you look at like how the party has acted on it, it's often not in line with what the platform says. So I think that that's just something to keep in mind. Is the platform is an aspirational document that the party elders, the party leaders, don't always, or I would say don't often abide by. But that said,
really?
that said, I think that I mean, the fact that they're at the table, I think it does at least show that they I mean, we'll say like 8 years ago, these kind of groups like Sunrise Movement or the AOCs of the world, that camp probably wouldn't have even been invited to the table at all. I think it shows that the movement has definitely gained power, and the balance has shifted more to the left within a discourse at the very least. I think execution is still up for question, but it shows that things are steadily changing. I mean, I can't imagine this having been in journalism in 2008 and 2012. I can't imagine these kind of people being invited to the table back then. So it's definitely a change, and I think it's something not just to brush to the side. I think it's something that shows that they have to take these people seriously.
You recently wrote about a new study and why the United Nations climate summits have largely been based on false premises of unproven technologies. Can you talk about that and why it's important, and what should the UN be doing instead?
Yeah, well, I think that the biggest takeaway from that study, which was by a bunch of researchers at Lancaster University in the UK, is sort of goes back to the geoengineering story. But it's not only geoengineering, that's like the latest iteration of it, but it's each time around historically, a lot these agreements are based on technologies that aren't, or ideas that aren't really there, and then they're saying that we will get there. I mean, it's sort of what sounds like good in one way. It's like, oh, we're going to get there, but a lot of times we're so far from getting there that they called it the term they use is mitigation deterrence. So basically, instead of mitigating things, or consuming less fossil fuels, or consuming, kind of looking at the root causes like our mass agriculture system, whatever you want to look at. Instead of mitigating those, we kind of kick the can to the side and say, well, we'll have this technology in several years, and that's what's going to save us. So we'll have this technique in several years, that's what's going to save us. And that's been through various ways, and always in different ways. That's been the technique that's been used that they pointed to since the very first summit in 1992. And I think that we're seeing that play out today, to go kind of full circle on this with geoengineering. What the new framework is called net zero, and that we see that in California. That's the aspiration, is quote unquote net zero. Sounds great. That means like we have our goal is to be net zero for carbon dioxide emissions and greenhouse gas emissions. What does that actually mean? The only way to achieve that would either be truly mitigating and cutting down on what we're doing, or massive geoengineering. And I think that we're seeing much more of the latter and much less of the former. That this is a pattern that has played out throughout history, is basically that what the paper concludes. I think it's a really important one to check out. It's not, it's, I would say it's written in more accessible language than a lot of academic papers, and it's pretty short. So I'd recommend people check it out. I wrote about it on the Real News as well.
You also wrote about Argentina's dead cow shale basin. Can you talk about why it's important and why, that it has become economically unviable? What does it tell us about the state of the oil industry globally?
Yeah, so it shows that it's not just the United States where the fracking industry is suffering greatly. In Argentina, this whole aspiration of they would have been the second commercial scale level fracking country besides the United States. And it was a lot of the same kind of companies, Exxon in particular, and others were really interested in Argentina. But basically, they never really able to scale it up. And now with this new economic crisis, it may never materialize or may not materialize for a very long time. And I think that Argentina is an interesting case study because they are heavily reliant on foreign debt, in particular from the International Monetary Fund, and they were hoping that oil and gas would be a way to repay that debt, and that may not happen. So we're going to see all kinds of politics that relate to oil and gas, but are not only oil and gas, that have to do with the IMF. And of course, the IMF is very tied to the United States government and the global powers of the world. So that'll be interesting and I think kind of scary to see how that plays out in Argentina in terms of austerity measures and in terms of how that impacts everyday people in Argentina. But yeah, it does relate back to the oil and gas industry, because they were pitching oil and gas and fracking as the way to repay that debt, and now that's not going to happen.
Wow, there's a lot going on here. Given all of these updates, are there any new campaigns or movements that you suggest our audience get involved in or take a look at?
Well, I would definitely, for those who are watching, to keep your eyes on this Keystone XL legal fight, which applies to the whole industry. And there's a lot of groups that are plugged into that. Like pretty much the entire climate movement that works on oil and gas issues is plugged into that, like Sierra Club, Center for Biological Diversity, Natural Resources Defense Council, and a whole bunch of others. Bold, Nebraska, Jane Cleave's group. All of those groups are co-plaintiffs in that particular case. So that's something to definitely keep your eyes on, and that'll play out in the appeals court in the coming weeks.
This is great. I'm very excited to hear about all of these things. Hey, one of the videos from the Real News suggested that the NRDC was considered the man of environmental.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. What
yeah, they are. I mean, I did just plug them. So, but now I'll
yeah, I know. That's why I thought, what's that?
They are. And
well,
I mean,
good,
so is Sierra Club.
Man.
Yeah, I mean, they play a mixed role. They actually do amazing legal work on these issues, like this. And I didn't mention that in that one. Maybe I should have, but it was just like in video. You have to kind of simplify things if you want to keep it digestible. But they are. I mean, to be fair, they do really good legal work on these bread and butter issues, like the National Environmental Policy Act and the stuff we've been talking about, pipelines. At the same time, I mean, they are considered part of the quote unquote big green, and that's that the groups within that camp are like Sierra Club, NRDC, the National Wildlife Federation, and I think there's like 10 groups that are considered part of that. It's not like an official group, but it's sort of how it's been looked at by scholars of this. But Yeah, I think that within that, like all those groups still do good and important work. But then I think that the other side of
Moore of interviews.
the other side of it is, I think that sometimes they broker deals with powerful Democrats that are not always what the grassroots want, and not always what the people who are affected by these decisions are calling for. So there's definitely there's definitely a divide within the climate community between the quote unquote big greens and the more frontline groups. That's played out for decades, and no one is saying that the big groups don't sometimes do and often do important work, but it sometimes means that they need to be held accountable for the not so great things that they do and the deals that they broker with the people that they have access to in power.
We've been speaking with Steve Horn, climate reporter and producer for the Real News Network. Steve, thanks so much for being on with us. I really appreciate it. We look forward to your next visit.
Good to be on again. Thanks for having me.
It's great. Stay well. You're watching. If you're watching us on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe. We bring interviews and commentary, 5 days a week. So stick with us. I'm Julianna Forlano. You can follow me personally also on Twitter @Julianna Forlano. We will see you tomorrow.